I'm addressing you today in my capacity as an entrepreneur, not so much wearing the hat of a past or present public official. My perspective is that, somewhat contrary to Murtaza's, that the eventual beneficial owner of state-owned enterprises is the finance ministry or the secretary to the treasury. And from the perspective of a finance ministry, what's most important about an SOE is it being efficiently run and serving the public and consumers effectively and efficiently. Secondly, is it functioning with treasury guarantees? Is it incurring losses? Or is it functioning on its own cash flows? And thirdly, it's important for the finance ministry to also ascertain if it is running at a loss, how do we mitigate such losses and generate tax revenue in the future by increasingly generating profits. Now, if it is not generating profits, I maintain, as mentioned by some of my fellow panel members, that privatization is not the only answer. There are many policy options available to the finance ministry. Now, I have had a role to play during my tenure as former chairman of the BOI and having set up this agency called National Agency for Public-Private Partnership in about 20 or more public-private partnerships and privatizations. Not one of these projects, the privatizations included, resulted in a strike. Not one of these privatizations that myself and some of my colleagues were involved in have resulted in a failure. Not one. Now, that leads me to my next question, which is perplexing me as to why today the concept of Wikinima or privatization has become a political liability. Now, in my own assertion, looking at this from a finance ministry perspective, Wikinima or selling, in my view, is the creation and mollycoddling of a state-owned enterprise or state asset that is a white elephant, resulting in the erosion of the country's balance sheet. Now, that's my interpretation of Wikinima, because there are state-owned enterprises that are not even meeting its operating costs from their operating revenue, let alone servicing its debt. So, as a consequence, in today's political arena, selling 15% of state-owned banks on the Colombo Stock Exchange has been termed a Wikinima. Selling the Colombo Hilton, which has never paid a dividend in the last 10 years, is considered a Wikinima. And of course, a partially completed Hyatt Hotel, which is up for sale, is also considered a Wikinima, including, of course, Sri Lankan Airlines, as Minister Iran pointed out. Now, this is quite different from the narrative that prevailed during my days as chairman of the BOI in the late 1990s. The narrative then was, and what drove divestiture and PPPs then, was can a state-owned business compete in a competitive marketplace? And we reached a conclusion, no. There's no evidence whatsoever in Sri Lanka, I'd like you to point out if I'm wrong in this, that there has been a single state-owned enterprise engaged in a competitive environment, leave aside the monopolies, that have given a return to the shareholder, the finance ministry. Now, my next question is, what do we do? I believe, in terms of moving forward, the finance ministry needs to become a shareholder activist, generating far greater control on state-owned enterprises. Now, how do we do this? I believe that, number one, all SOE boards, based on the assumption that I have seen in the last 10 or 15 years, that the chairman or the key board members are either the minister's brothers, friends, family, etc., and the minister usually functions as the chairman of the board. I believe that the finance ministry, for every loss-making state-owned enterprise, needs to appoint an advisory board. And the advisory board must be controlled by the finance ministry, and key board decisions involving fiscal matters must be cleared by the advisory board. And these key advisory boards must be manned by either the Secretary of the Treasury or a DST. Number two, reporting. You take, for example, the CEB and CPC and Water Board, all of which are loss-making due to subsidies, as was pointed out earlier. the P&L of the subsidized element of the business must be separated from the P&L of the non-subsidized element. And only then can we have transparency in terms of where the money of the treasury is going. My number 3 recommendation, if divestiture is not an option, consider management contracts. Why cannot Luxor be managed under a management contract? Why cannot CWE be managed under a management contract? Why does the Building Material Corporation have 12 billion rupees worth of land assets and cannot service a 600 million rupee loan? We must consider public-private partnerships, therefore, as a key element of state enterprise reform. Number 4, the finance minister must have the right to appoint private auditors in addition to the Auditor General as and when he or she chooses. Number 5, it must be made mandatory for state-owned enterprises to comply with CSC type, Colombo Stock Exchange type disclosures. Number 6, we must break up conflicts of interest that are prevailing in particularly the port sector and the electricity sector. I don't want to go into details. Number 7, all shares of subsidiary companies of state-owned enterprises must be vested at least 51% in the finance ministry in order to avoid corruption and losses literally leaked through private enterprises, 100% owned by some of these state-owned enterprises. Number 8, activate what is called a public investment committee, where all public and private investment projects involved in PPPs are channeled through a centralized public investment committee, where the line agency or the state-owned enterprise must make a case as to why that project should qualify for funding from the consolidated fund or ERD, external resources, or as a PPP. Number 9, this is my last recommendation. The finance ministry must improve its communication and stakeholder engagement. It was nothing but an effective communication strategy that allowed us to privatize telecom, allowed us to privatize gas, and allowed us to do the PPP at the Port of Colombo in the late 1990s. So, let's look at in the case of why we decided that the government cannot run an airline. If you look at the period prior to the ending of the war in 2009 under Emirates management, hardly any growth in passengers carried. At the end of the war, from 2009 onwards to 2018, you can see the growth in tourism. But look at the bottom slide, what happened in terms of losses. And from 2009 up to 2019, where you see all the red ink, is under the management of the government. So I rest my case as far as whether a government can run a business in a competitive environment. So therefore, I'm going to slip through these slides, but do want to point out that in the case of the privatization of part of the Colombo port, what led us to do that was ship waiting time and strikes. After SAGT was implemented, ship waiting time reduced by 85%. And if I am to go so far as to say, what made Colombo Port a hub port was the introduction of competition to compete with the SLPA. And also I must point out that in 2015, according to the numbers I have, Dr. Godeheva, SLPA made a huge loss, and it was mitigated to a great extent by virtue of contributions made by the PPP operators, and the loss was caused primarily on account of the interest rate and the loan principal payments connected to the Hambantota loan. Of course, SLPA is quite profitable at the moment since that loan has been removed from its balance sheet. So, yes. So, as I mentioned earlier, the solution is the finance minister needs to become a shareholder activist, exerting far greater control over SOEs. Final comments. A key reason for the low average GDP growth in the last 7 years, and state-owned enterprises were key actors in what I'm pointing out here. Reasons for low GDP growth: fiscal mismanagement, coupled with misallocation of resources, coupled with revenue leakages, coupled with the private sector, certain elements of the private sector, I need to qualify, working hand in glove with the government, perpetuating the above. And finally, the failure of the government to implement reform measures in a timely manner. So in conclusion, I do not deny the fact that wrong things have happened. But in my experience, as a public official for a certain short period of time, in my career, I have found very simply, when you have the right people working within the right processes, minus political interference, there has always been a good outcome. So it's not about whether privatization is right or wrong. It is about having the right people executing those transactions within following a right process which is transparent and accountable without the interference of politicians. I'm very confident that these state enterprises can be reformed and we can reach a higher plane of GDP growth, which sadly today is on a lower plane over the last 7 years at about 3.8% compared to during the war years in the late 1990s when this economy grew at about 5.02%. Thank you very much.